I want to talk about, I would say, two little short stories, which you can watch on either screen, because it's going to be the same. We know that cities operate and are understood at different scales, from the largest scale of the region to the scale of the human being. And New York City, like I think all cities, can be described and understood by examining its various scales. So my first short story will be to talk about these, what I've identified as 7 different scales. The first scale was produced in 1922 by a civic and business leaders of New York City, an organization that called itself the Committee on the Regional Plan of New York and its Environs. It was a group of people of which Lewis Mumford is perhaps one of the most important as we know today, and was continuously involved in this organization. It wasn't a government organization. It started as this committee. It was concerned with what they called the metropolitan region, which was a fairly new term. It involved 3 states, so it overlapped the kind of jurisdiction of 3 different governments, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And it described itself as being involved in the area that's a 50-mile radius from Times Square, which is obviously very city-centric and maybe a little bold to feel that New York City is the center of a 50-mile radius. But it gave them a territory to look at. And they looked at the regional needs specifically for New York City, water, transportation, open space, urban and suburban growth, the things that we still do today. And out of that, the Regional Plan Association was formed in 1929, and they produced the first regional plan. These are only sort of emblems, but on the left is an image from the first 1929 plan. And it was concerned with those issues that I just mentioned. It was said that it was the world's first long-range metropolitan plan. I'm not sure if that's true, but they claimed that. And then this organization continues today, the Regional Plan Association. In 1968, about 40 years later, it made the second plan. The second plan and 1968 are interesting because they were concerned with suburban sprawl, the issue of local transportation, the commuter transportation issues, and they began to look at New York City as having satellite centers. So no longer was Times Square the only center of this region, but in fact sub-centers. The third plan, which it was titled The Region at Risk, is 1996, about 30 years later. So we went from 40 to 30 years. And that was, in a way, less concerned about the satellite city, but more of a kind of network of exchange between New York City and the region, which and its more polycentric structure. But the title is interesting, Region at Risk. And the image on the right is from the 1969 plan, and they're way too small for me to go into them, but I put them up as images. The second scale of the city is not involved with geography, it's involved with politics. In 1898, New York City, which was only the island of Manhattan, incorporated other territories into the metropolitan area and into New York City itself. So this map, which shows lines of the Bronx at the top, Queens to the right, Brooklyn below, and Staten Island, were the cities that were incorporated into New York City. And this is a scale, but it's a political scale in a sense. It's a scale that has a certain size, but it also involves much more than the city center and a much more diverse kind of character of New York City. And I made this map in this way because these territories obviously have nothing to do with geography. Staten Island looks like it's part of New Jersey. The Bronx looks like it's part of Westchester and up north on the Hudson. And Brooklyn and Queens are sometimes called part of Long Island. It's a scale less than 50 miles, but also of a very different character. The third scale on the left is a scale made up of some incidences, and I'll trace a little bit of that in a moment, but I want to kind of go through these scales from large to small. And this next scale of Manhattan involves the structure of the 1811 Commissioner's Plan, which established the street pattern and the avenues north of Washington Square. But outside of, and not even thought of by the commissioners, I've made this diagram that shows from Park Avenue over to Fifth Avenue, going from right to left, 6th, 7th, and 8th Avenue, three of those terminating in Central Park, the large rectangle, and Broadway. Broadway, which the commissioners didn't recognize as being anything at the time, continued to exist on its own will of some sort and power. It was originally perhaps a Native American trail between the lower part of Manhattan and Albany at the top of the Hudson. Became instrumental in this scale that I'm presenting. Because every time Broadway crosses an avenue, it creates a major crosstown street. And at every one of those intersections, there's one of the important spaces of the city. So at the bottom is 14th Street crossing, and the next is, well, I should say Union Square and Park Avenue, the beginning of Park Avenue. Then there's Madison Square and 23rd Street, Herald Square, 34th Street, Times Square, 42nd Street, and then a little bit of slipping around Columbus Circle at 59th, but could have been or should have been at 57th. There's an interesting little ambiguity there. So this creates a network of a pattern at a certain scale. And this pattern is interesting because the centers of these spaces are critical, but where the streets end is not so important in Manhattan. They go till they hit the water or places. The ends of the grid aren't important. It's really this central interaction between streets, avenues, and particularly at this scale, Broadway. The next scale on the right is one that comes much more directly from the Commissioner's Plan, 1911 plan above Washington Square, which was all settled. So it's sort of important to know that above Washington Square there were small towns and farms in 1811 that continued to persist even as New York City developed with this plan. But the Commissioner's Plan, with the help of some historical background, because I think they're more clever things than maybe these commissioners were, laid out the strategy for major avenues running north-south, 100 feet wide, mixed use, big scale, and minor streets running east-west as residential streets. 100-foot wide avenues, 60-foot wide residential streets. Long residential streets, short segments in the avenues. So the whole syncopation of the city is sort of structured on this rhythm. And I think it's important to see this sort of block formation that I'll come to as creating, I suppose, what weavers are more concerned with, a kind of multi-direction where stuff going one way is different from stuff crossing it going the other way. This was the commissioner's plan, and I'm sure that you can not see very much of it. It's nice that they drew the topography. I thought that was quite clever of them. And they have, in the bottom part of the plan, put New York City as it was, and in very faint lines, I think you can see this grid that they proposed to run wherever it went, over hill, towards water, whatever, as a system which they explained as being sensible for the sale of real estate. So it had no spatial thinking to it, and there was very little open space. What was set aside never became the real open space in New York. But nevertheless, this provided the kind of fabric, the tessuto of New York City that that we I've explained with the other grid. Some part of the reason for the commissioner's plan was that the British had common lands up through the middle of New York City, and because that was held by a government, it was available and not privatized to be useful for the commissioners. And you can see in these two diagrams the influence of this past on the creation of the commissioner's plan of 1811. You can also, well, I should say that the avenues aren't an equal increment. All the streets are very rigorous in their dimensions. The avenues, however, are spaced somewhere between 600, a little more than 600, and a little more than 900 feet. So there's a great deal of variation. And that variation comes, in fact, from this, the Commons land property allotment. Also, the commissioners had thought that, I probably should have asked how many of you have been to New York. I assume probably most all of you have. Lexington Avenue and Madison Avenue were thought to be alleyways, an alleyway system. And interestingly, Madison Avenue became Madison Avenue of great importance in later times. So even that aspect of the commissioner's plan evolved in different ways. The next two scales, I think, also aren't physical, but they're kind of social cultural scales. And on the left, I've diagrammed districts which don't have distinct boundaries. They're a little fuzzy on the edges, but they are places, they're a kind of scale of New York known as these clusters of different, sometimes physical characteristics, sometimes social, cultural characteristics. So the financial district, we know, Tribeca and Soho are very new in the second half of the 20th century. Chinatown has evolved. Greenwich Village is old and kind of stable on the west side, but new and was quite changing on the east side in the second half of the 20th century. Chelsea has exploded. It was quiet not so long ago. So these are dynamic districts. And there are just a few. On the right is another scale of the way we know the city. And they are also, you might say districts, but they're actually sort of little enclaves of identity within these bigger districts. So for instance, where I have Midtown on the left, on the right you can see Midtown, Midtown South, the Garment District, which is very distinctive. It is in Midtown, but it's its own thing. Hell's Kitchen is a historical name. Interesting to conjure up. And Upper West Side is broken down. Lincoln Square wasn't there until they created the cultural element there. So these also have grown over time. They're sort of flexible but probably in a Kevin Lynch sense of districts, it's how people understand where they are in the city. And they have a scale between these two. The origins of New York City are not that 1812 grid. They're New Amsterdam, no doubt a relationship to Old Amsterdam, but the structure of New Amsterdam, which even had canals, where'd this go? I think you can see some canal structure up through this portion. But the significant difference between Old Amsterdam and New Amsterdam is Broadway. This doesn't work now. It's pretty clear in the map, which is a north-south street starting at the Battery, as it still does, and stretches all the way to Wall Street in this map to form the earliest part of the city. By the time the 1811 plan was made, we have a kind of growth in multiple directions that comes out of the kind of New Amsterdam plan, mostly following the waterfront. So you have the next generation, is this section. You can see it's parallel to the water. Then along the village, it's related to the Hudson River, and even the area of the East Village and around Tompkins Square and so forth, sort of projections in from the water. Very different from the idea of the Commissioner's plan. So this system gets transformed, and it's interesting that Broadway, which you can see on the top here, on the diagonal, and the anomaly to the system, is the system south of 12th Street in Manhattan. So Broadway is the kind of critical armature of the, all the way back to the New Amsterdam plan, going up till the Commissioner's plan occurs, and then goes onto its sort of breaking the system trend. That was a little bit of a side, but I thought I needed to place these other issues into that sort of historical context. The final scale is the block, and the block is created by this avenue to street relationship, which I've described. The fact that it's a rectangle and not a square has implications compared to Barcelona. And the fact of the different widths and the kind of character that comes from those conditions of quiet versus active and so forth. But within the block there was a pattern, and this has to do with the real estate interests of the commissioners, of subdivision. And in the right-hand corner you can see the 100-foot by 25-foot slot that buildings could be put into, and would fill the block with a facade on the street and a yard in the back, and a very British kind of pattern of the party wall, not courtyard types, but these long striations. So that's sort of the scales of New York in sort of fairly quickly, but I think it helps describe New York, but I think it's something to always look for in every city, because it clearly exists between, and now that in this, certainly the second half of the 20th century, that we understand the region much better as an important element, not just feeding the city, but in fact the city feeds the region in our later awareness of that. Down to the sidewalk block around a block. In the early 90s, in my practice with Behan Karahan, we had an office in Lower Manhattan and proposed a study that we got some grant funding for, to study what we call the open spaces of Tribeca. And Tribeca, you probably all know, but it's the triangle below Canal. euphemism. Soho is south of Houston. It's not London. And so on the left, you can see shaded in the triangle bounded by Canal Street on the north, Hudson River to the west, the sort of City Hall, Broadway to the east, and slightly vague boundaries down towards the World Trade Center on the south. What we found there in our neighborhood at the time was that, in fact, there's a whole bunch of spaces that are undeveloped because they seem to have just been deposited there by the street system. And on the right are 8 sites that we proposed to study that had no particular character, except maybe the biggest round one, which is the entrance into the Holland Tunnel. But on the upper left is the end of Canal Street. And I should say, it's interesting to me that since that time, most of these have happened in the kind of 6th to the 5th way. The plan was posited and it worked. It was done by other people over time. But anyway, there's from the upper left to Canal Street to the center bottom of Chambers Street, we identified these sites. And we studied the grid patterns, these 2 conditions, the Broadway, which becomes the plan above, and the still remnants of the projections in from the rivers and the waterfront areas that affect the area of Tribeca. So we sorted out 2 different grid systems, which in fact are in this, I think in this cubistic way of sort of simultaneity, fluctuate. I think like a lot of the grid does right outside here, where you're not sure if you're on the diagonal or the orthogonal until you know it well enough. But this Tribeca has this characteristic of the overlapping of these 2 systems. So we're looking at tiny little triangles left from 2 grids crashing into one another. And we asked ourselves, what does this relate to? Do we just do little triangles? Do we identify Tribeca? Or is there a bigger structure that these triangles somehow relate to? And drawing the avenues on the right from the right-hand side to the left of 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Avenue as they hit Central Park, as you project them down, although they grew the other way, projected up, they all converge in Tribeca. So the source of the avenue system, which we think of as the 1811 plan, just put on there, or the Commons plan, interestingly engages the area of New Amsterdam and the growth into the village, and sponsors, it's the kind of seeds of the projection of the city as it grew to the north. So this seemed like we should reveal this to the people of Tribeca. They're sitting on the source of 8th Avenue, even though it seems very far away. And this was a sort of critical diagram for us to see. And here we've gone to the biggest scale we could find to look for influences on our tiny little square scale of triangles. In these 2 figure ground drawings, the left is the way New York is, and the right is our plan. And I think you can see our plan is sort of modest. It's hard to find. It's we were talking the other night about chameleons, that it's sort of hidden because these triangles actually were there, and we're restructuring them in minor ways. We're not changing their configuration. We're changing their identity in ways. We were able to work in the Hudson River, working with some early river ecologists who took over one of the piers to do studies on how to clean up the Hudson River. So the big hook up at the top of Canal Street down to Battery Park City was also, we also looked at that and took that on as a little piece that we could play with. These are three-dimensional projections looking from north to south. Again, I won't talk about them too much, point them out, but they're subtle. For instance, that's the Holland Tunnel, where we proposed a big playground on top of the road, to the spaghetti that's underneath it, and exists today. And the other ones are in that texture, but this provides the kind of physical characteristic that those triangles are in. On the left, we made a diagram of the kind of sequence, flow of spaces. They don't have a lot of clear definition. They're a mix of the two grids. And interestingly, in the sequences that we were looking for, most of the Hudson River grid is plays a role, and not so much as the New York City grid, if I separate those two, until it gets into Battery Park, where the whole plan, the 60s plan of Battery Park, was to try to actually weave these two grids together as well. On the right are our little spaces, the surrounding kind of street walls of those, and they tend to be much more the integration of the two grids. Left is again the figure ground of the finished project, and the right is a kind of reversal of the network of open spaces. Our little triangles kind of in the center of the plan, and the kind of other spaces, City Hall on the lower right, and the whole waterfront sequence on the left on the Hudson. And so we were able to position our triangles into a bigger network of open space. Then we took three of these spaces to look at as kind of case studies. Duane Park, Hudson Triangle, which became named as Bogardus Triangle after the cast iron architect, and Finn Square. And we made a kind of list of elements. So now we're going to a tiny scale. We're not just talking about the space, but we're talking about how to modulate the space, and what were the things that we could work with to do that. We have context at the top, form, paving, gates and fences, trees and planting, and urban furniture. Context was important because each of these triangles was in a different kind of condition to create a different kind of park or milieu. Duane Park, which on the right is the upper triangular one, is it's sort of embedded into the residential area of Tribeca, and is a passive space that you can sit in, you can get in the middle, you can kind of be enclosed in the space. On the bottom right, the Bogardus Triangle or Hudson Triangle is right at the intersection of Chambers, which goes to City Hall and the municipal building to the right, to the waterfront to the left. It's a subway stop. It's a very busy intersection of West Broadway and the beginning of 8th Avenue. So we marked that with information. Because of that, we created, and with the community, we worked with the Tribeca Community Association and Community Board 1, we developed an idea of a park that you looked at, that you would, what we call a viewing garden, because there's no time to stop. Everyone's moving, as opposed to Duane Park. And then at Finn Square, which is kind of in the lower part of the drawing on the right, we proposed closing off a section of streets because there's so many streets coming together at the two grids, that we could in fact make a pedestrian connection to three of our other spaces that go to 7th Avenue and 6th Avenue. So they are the origins. That little guy on the right is the beginning of 6th Avenue. And they all have different names, so people don't recognize this condition. In every one of them, with a paving system, we proposed the two grids. So the paving in every one would explain Tribeca, the triangle below Canal, with the grid system. The gates and fences varied depending on whether it was a passive park, a viewing garden, a walking through space like Finn Square, and trees and planting and urban furniture all were used to develop the particular character to make these fit nicely into their context. These are the three triangles. This is actually Bogardus on the left, which we were trying to create a little false perspective up 8th Avenue because we found that space on the edge over there actually is in the middle of 8th Avenue. So in one place you could sort of safely stand in the middle of a street, and we wanted to point that out with our recognition that this begins 8th Avenue. And then there's the other two spaces, the Finn Square on the right, where we actually had the wonderful opportunity to design the subway station underneath and the entry to the subway. My first building in New York. 2 columns. And a roof and a gutter. So these are the three spaces, the viewing garden on the left, the passive enclosing space in the center, and the walk-through condition on the right. Views of the same thing. This is the perspective going the other way on the left, the enclosed garden and the pedestrian walkway, which has the Empire State Building in view. Because we worked with the community, we were able to, in a kind of bottom-up situation, we were able to have an exhibition in Tribeca. It was beginning to be a kind of arts center that got priced out and moved to Chelsea and Hoboken and other places, as has always happened. And the Department of Transportation said, okay, we'll build one. And they built the Bogardus Triangle. And you can see we didn't get our wish of 2 pavings to sort out the grid, but we did get the grid etched deeply into the concrete. So it gives an impression of what we're trying to achieve. And this is the viewing garden. So I'll sort of end with a few views of what could we do with that. We're invited to Milan. We're given an area that we don't know much about, the Rubettino area. And we tried, before we got here, before students had seen Milan, to study certain things and to kind of apply this notion of different scales. So what is the scale of Rubettino? I think we were a little shocked when we got here, but we tried to learn. And we tried to learn from looking at things that were known. We tried to learn from the Piazza del Duomo, the Galleria, the Piazza La Scala, and that whole sequence. And that's been a valuable tool to measure what we're looking at. We looked at the 2 rings and spaced the gates from those. On the right, San Lorenzo, out to Porta Genova, and San Ambrogio on the left, and the 2 remnants of the gates. Interestingly, the Stazione at the Porta Genova is outside of the wall, and we're outside of the wall, so there's interesting lessons we could look at. Porta Romana, and then Porta Venezia with the whole network to the Piazza Repubblica and the gardens and so forth. So we kind of came with that bit of information to try to understand the scale, but we also knew that we had to deal with this scale. And a number of our students aren't going to stop at Rubettino. We're going all the way to Sagrate, and we're going to look at the rail yards and so forth for the rest of our semester. So the little rectangle on the right of our site for this 2 weeks is going to become a bigger investigation of those relationships. So as I say, I think trying to show you the scales of New York, a project in New York that tries to deal with those, and seeing where we go with Milan has been, valuable for us, and hope this has been interesting for you. Thank you.